Well, not exactly. These properties only got purchased since maybe the 1980s. Wow. Brought back into the church, and they've been working for the last 30, 40 years.
So somebody else can live there.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure. They may have been owned by other Adventists, maybe not. That would be a lot of work to try to figure out that history, but you could do it by going looking at the deeds and so forth.
No, you should not think that's I'm gonna say what's the bad thing about the original house is still stay there.
They'll stay there.
Yeah.
Any known history of anyone living in the house after the white? Oh yes, there were other people that lived there. I don't know who they are. Do you know where they were at that or not? You can figure that out. You know, it's a simple feature. I highly suspect that the Adventists that they sold it to Adventists. I actually suspect, I don't remember, that may be the house where they used the home sanitarium for a while, or it may be the other house that they have. I'm not sure. But at least one of their properties they actually gave, and it was using the so-called hospital for a little bit. So probably not that one. Okay, we're going here. Meeting once. Okay. Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Welcome, 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 welcome. Okay, I think there's a few more people coming in, perhaps. This is the newest building of the Adventist historic, or the historic Adventist village. This is not an original; it is a replicated building depicting what the publishing house looked like when it was moved here. So the publishing work, how does that begin? Does anybody? Yes. Is this the original location of the? I don't think so. I'm quite certain it's not. But yes, it's so. But nevertheless, it's the same size. We know the dimensions and the same. We have drawings, and so it looks, at least from the outside, as it looked back then. Exactly how they laid it out inside, we don't know. And so, anyhow, how does the publishing work begin in the church? Does anybody know how that begins?
Ellen White asked her husband to start writing.
Yes, that's right. But why did she do that? Just because she had this idea? The vision.
Saw lights.
Yes, streams of light. That's right. In the year 1848, Ellen has a vision where she sees James White. He's instructed to publish a paper, and it will be as streams of light going around the entire book.
Mm-hmm.
And that right there is the inspiration for James and others to start printing the first paper. What was it called? Do you remember the name of the first paper? It came out in 1849. Present Truth is correct. That's right. The Present Truth was one paper, and then they started publishing another one called the Advent Review. It's out of Harriet. And that one is going to continue on to this very day, although it's been renamed several times. It is now known as the Adventist Review. And that paper is launched in 1850. And that starts in New England, okay? In Maine, later in Connecticut, and then moving through different parts of upstate New York. James and Ellen White are publishing the paper, but guess what? James and Ellen are writing stuff for the paper, writing material for the paper, and they're living in other people's homes. They don't have a press. And so they're having to send it to somebody else to do the printing for them. And those other people, did they keep the Sabbath? No, they did not. And so they're doing the work for Adventists on the Sabbath, which bothered the whites. They had to put up with it for a while, as long as time lasted, until they could finally afford to buy their own press. In 1852, they moved to Rochester, New York, and they got a home there that they're renting, and they got a press. But they put the press in the house. And guess what? They also have all the other people that are working there in their house in Rochester. At one point, there was as many as 20 people, including children, living in that home. And they had Sabbath worship services in that house every week. Can you imagine all the cacophony and the chaos and the noise? Oh, it's exciting. Oh, my word, that's how it began. And kids getting into it, and that's how it worked. But let me tell you, why did you need 20 people? It's because it took a lot of people to do the work. What you see here is a Washington hand press. It is not the one that Adventists used, because sadly that one burned in the fire at the Review Herald in the 1901 or 2 or 3, whatever it was. But this is one that's just like it. And so what you would do is you would take a form like this, and you would have to go through and you would have to set every letter of every word by hand. It takes a minute or two. They got fast, really. So they could do it really quick. They do this, and you would set this whole thing, and this would be one sheet. Actually, one sheet had 4. This one is probably, well, the way the Adventists did it, they had one sheet here. This is not the size. This bed is big enough for it to be 4. Yes, it would look like this. Yeah. It would look like this when it's all set and typed and so forth. And you can see it there. And that's going to be the front page, right? And then after you get the type set, okay, and so you literally have, that's one job, the typesetter, okay, to start counting. After the typesetter has set the type, then you have somebody do what? You got to get ink on the type, don't you? So you have a roller boy or somebody who has little swatches, like little rubber things that you can do it, where you can roll it. You got to put ink on this on the type. Then you have another person who puts a sheet of paper here. They fold this down on top. It slides underneath here. You pull the handle, and this will press it down to where the ink adheres to the paper. Now you're done, right? No. Why? Because you got to do several pages, right? You got to do 8 pages, but that's not all. After, what happens with the paper now that you've done? The ink's dry, right? Yeah. You got to let it dry. So guess what you're going to see? This room is nice and clear and clean for walk, no problems. No. In a printing house, particularly in the 19th century, you've got lines going every which way, and you're hanging paper everywhere so that the ink can dry. And you have to keep it in some kind of order so that you can put it back together, right? And then you can eventually send it out. Now, once you have it dried and you put it together, and you've got to fold it and you've got to send it through the mail. So you have several different types of jobs here that are going to be going on. And so it takes 20 people to do that. And some of the people that are working in this house that are living with the whites in Rochester, they're including a cook, because if everyone's working on writing and publishing, you got to have a cook. Then you have someone to take care of the children. Okay. So you've got people like that. So it takes a daycare. It took a small little army. And so that's how it started. And can you imagine how difficult that would have been? Would you have enjoyed that kind of life? Think about someone getting sick. What happens? You live in such close quarters. Everyone gets sick. And guess what? That is the tragedy. And in Rochester, I think there's at least 3 Adventist pioneers who died. It was sad. There were joys, though, too, because also some people got married. Uriah and Harriet Smith. Uriah Smith will become the editor of the Review and Herald in 1855. He met his wife, and they got married while they were living in the wife's home. And so that was in 1857. And so actually, no, I guess it wouldn't have been, forgive me, they didn't get married while they were there, because it was 1857. They would have been after they got to Battle Creek, but they met there. So the romance was born. So there was high times, there were low times. It was difficult, but you can understand why Battle Creek would be attractive, right? You have the opportunity to have your own building. Have mercy. So you can understand why it wasn't a hard sell to get the whites to come here. And so this building, one that looks just like this, would have been used for that purpose. You can see other rooms here. If you look around the corner here, this is depicting the editor's room where the editor would go through and not only write their editorial, but they would have to go through and check every page to look for typos. Okay? So they would be doing that work. Now, one other fun fact that I can point out to you when it comes to printing history. Now, when you have big letters and small letters, what do you call those big letters and small letters?
Capital, common.
Call them capital letters, yes, if they're big. What are some other words you can call them? For the big letters, you can also call them
Bold.
uppercase and lowercase. Where do we get the words and names, uppercase and lowercase? Right here. In a print shop, the big letters were always literally housed in the upper cases, and the smaller letters were literally housed in the lower cases. I don't know why they did it that way. That seems backwards to me because you needed a lot more lowercase letters than uppercase. You could have been it over a lot more, but that's how they did it. And that's how we get the names.
Mhm.
Okay. Any
I'm tired.
questions?
I'm tired.
What's up now? Me going right over consider what we done. Not aware.
I know.
Yeah. The upper
So I said, Harriet, have on a Wednesday, she have class at 3,
Mhm.
when it's 30 and finish 9:30. Two classes. I said, that's ridiculous.
3:30?
3:30 to 6:31 and
6:30
6:30
to
to
9:30.
9:31.
business started to boom after they got their
I
own
must know the students.
space here.
Cut off. Another time, the class. And walk up and on come back. They tell you that they're going to start. You kind of decreasing the term, diminishing the term.
After this, you get the health reformer.
I have.
Mhm.
I don't know how they.
You know, it's uppercase. Yes. That was interesting, dog. That was interesting. Capital letter. Yes. I'm tired. I think I'm gonna pause after this one. Till I'm a step down from.
Very good. Come on. All right.
Mm-mm. That's a lot.
Oh, it's on the uppercase.
Okay, our next destination is going to be the site of the Jan Lafaro Home.
That person again.
Jan Lamboro. You should. I'm gonna take a break. I'm tired.
I know.
Let's record on the You don't have to point it. It's on. No, Haitian.
Haitian.
Yes. Yes. Me. In the summer. Oh, still a lot of walking. But I love this village. We should have more Adventist village around. Yes, yes, yes. And across from the NCU too.
Yeah, that's it.
Was that right?
Your workers.
Right. Right. Since it's right here, I'm just gonna pause and listen. Since it's right here.
Okay, where we're standing here is the site of Jan Lafaro's home. It would have been right around here in line with these others here. And the first story that I want to tell you is one of tragedy. One that I want to help you understand why we need to have good historians doing good work in the church. Why is the home not here?
Fire.
It's because Adventists tore it down after we had purchased the village property here. The house was standing, and according to the records that were used, which were not the best sources, it appeared to be that that house right there was Jan Lafaro's house. When they did further research, they discovered, oh my goodness, Jan Lafaro's house is here, and another house I have between these two And they tore this one down because it wasn't an Adventist home, they thought. Oh,
That's not even one.
oh man, that's tragic. That's tragic. If you can do good research and make sure you're doing it right, then you wouldn't make mistakes like that. But as I will tell you, I am grateful that that house has survived, and I'll tell you why when we get in there. That house has important stories to tell as well. But Jan Lafaro, as you know, was an important Adventist leader, and he and his wife, Mary, I believe, are the ones living in this house. And this is where they have a lot of triumph and tragedy as well. They live near the Whites and lots of other Adventists here, of course. But this is where their daughter Teresa was born, and she dies in infancy. And also, there's twins that are born to Jan Lafaro's first wife, and she gives birth and doesn't survive. And so a lot of tragedy happens. I mean, this is 19th century. I am sure that if it was in the present day, it would have all lived. It wouldn't have been a big deal. But that happened. Infant mortality and the mortality of spouses or of women in particular in childbirth was high. But in any case, this is the site of Jan Lafaro's home, and it gives you some perspective. That house right down there, that small one, is James White's parents, and then you can still see James and Ellen White's house right there. So they're just a stone's throw away, right? It's definitely an Adventist community. Now, let's enter this home here, and I'll tell you why I'm excited it has survived, even though it was not lived in by an Adventist.
Right. Now I have to go. Yes. Yeah, he captures me.
Look for the Oak Hill Cemetery. Oak Hill Cemetery. You're welcome. You're welcome. All right, let's go in. And I got the key. All the way.
Okay.
All right, come on in. I think there's a little bit of cool air, so come on in and we can keep it in. Awesome. Close the door when you're done. All right. So this house was not owned by an Adventist. An Adventist did not live here. To our knowledge, it was owned by Mrs. Harriet Henderson Tucker.
Oh.
Mrs. Harriet Henderson Tucker was an African-American woman born into slavery.
Mm.
And I think that I'm excited. I can say I'm excited that this house survived because it gives us a place to talk about Adventist history in relation to race relations and Black Adventist history as well. And if we had known Jan Lafaro's actual true home, this one would have been torn down instead. So take your pick. So I'm grateful that we have this house. Now, Harriet, what was her name again? What did I say? Harriet Tucker. Harriet Henderson Tucker. She was born into slavery, but at 2 years of age, her father carries her here on the Underground River. And that is an amazing thing. Being born into slavery was no joke. Slavery was here in America from the inception of our history. From 1619, when you have the first white settlers coming and settling in Massachusetts area, you have slaves brought in to work for the white masters. And of course, at that time, it's not plantation slavery. Most families that have slaves, they have one or two or maybe a family. But as time goes on, it will grow and it will grow and it will grow and it will grow. It never took off. It's become a major plantation-based system in the North, but in the South, it did. What did it take for that? It took Andrew Jackson, President of the United States, who decided that it was best to kick Native Americans off their land in Georgia and other places, in Tennessee, in the Deep South, Mississippi and Alabama. And so he sent them out on the Trail of Tears, and they forced Native Americans onto reservations further west. What did they do with that land after it was available? It was all of a sudden just available for the taking. And who got it? White people got it for free or for a very low cost. And what do they do with that space? They turn it into a place for large plantations. And so we start to see plantations growing as a result primarily of the frontiers and so forth. And so this is where you start to see the rise of plantation-based slavery, where you have hundreds and hundreds of slaves on a single plantation. And what are they doing primarily? They're picking cotton. And cotton becomes king, as they say, and for good reasons, at least in the minds of white landowners, because it makes you rich and wealthy. It was very lucrative. It was very productive. It was not, as some people have argued in the past based upon their pro-South notions, it was not a dying institution that was not profitable, that would eventually become extinct with it, even if there wasn't a civil war. That is not true. It was incredibly profitable, so much so that it was driving U.S. economy, and not just U.S. economy, but global economy as well. England, for example, and much of Europe, they are some of the biggest purchasers of cotton. And the South, the American South, is the biggest producer of cotton in the world. And so America and the slave system is doing a major thing for world economy. And this country was literally built upon the backs of slaves. Over the history of our nation, there was about 10 million slaves. By the Civil War, there were 4 million living at one time in 1860. That's a lot of people. So where did Adventists fit into this story? We're actually playing a role there, because Adventism is born when slavery is still legal. A lot changes in America in the year 1831. 1831 is where you see, in some sense, the beginning of what we call the Antebellum era. Antebellum simply means before the war, typically in U.S. history before the Civil War. And so 1831 was a year of major change for several reasons. Number one, that's the year that William Lloyd Garrison, a white abolitionist, is rising up and starting to publish on January 1, 1831, a newspaper called The Liberator. And that newspaper is the first organ that starts to gather both blacks and whites together in a conversation that can create a movement that's organized to actually seek to abolish slavery. Yes, there had been abolitionists all the way back to the beginning. The first slaves that had come to this country from 1619 forward, they didn't want to be slaves, and they fought for their liberty as well, some successfully, some not. But before 1831, it's primarily black slaves, abolitionists, who are fighting against the oppression that they're in, and very few white people are opening up and recognizing that there's oppression. You might ask, why? Why is that the case? Isn't it so obvious that slavery was wrong when you're putting chains like this on people's ankles and sometimes even hands, around necks where they get neck collars? Isn't it obvious that it was an evil because you're separating families? Plantation owners are raping women, and you're doing all kinds of other things like beating them with whips. Isn't it obvious? No, it's not. At least for people living back, including people in the North. It is a false thing. If you think that most people in the North are abolitionists, you are dead wrong. Abolitionists were a tiny minority of the population in the North. Only about maybe 5 or 6% at their height. Very little. Very few people were abolitionists. And abolitionists demanded immediate emancipation for slaves and equal rights for black people. Other people that held other views on slavery, like colonizationism, they were simply trying to make America a white nation. And they were trying to ship black people to Africa or some other place because they didn't want them to live there. And so even though the colonizationists were sometimes saying, oh yeah, we're going to try to liberate slaves eventually, gradually, whatever, what they were doing primarily is sending free black people, primarily from the new one, out of America to make America white. And so the abolitionists are different. They stood out as a radical group. And the primary thing that distinguishes them, it starts here. You're recognizing that slavery is a clear moral evil. You're listening to the slaves themselves. People at this time did not think that black people were trustworthy. So if a slave comes to you and tells you about their experience, you would think that they're lying to you. It was not legal for a black person to testify against a white person in courts, even in the North. You could not trust a black person. But white abolitionists started to listen in the 1830s, early 1830s, and so forth. And so a movement starts to gather around William Lloyd Garrison's paper, and it starts to go out on the basis that slavery is a clear moral wrong. It is a sin. And that right there, recognizing that slavery is a sin, is the baseline to become an abolitionist, because non-abolitionists would not make that claim. Did you know that every major denomination in this country refused to condemn slavery as an unqualified sin until the middle of the Civil War?
Mm.
Can you imagine? In spite of all the stories that they are in spite of the pictures and drawings that people are showing, look at what happens. In spite of all of that, they refused until the middle of the Civil War, when it looked as though the North was going to beat the South. Finally, they said, yeah, it's a clear moral evil. When they could use it for their political advantage, that is when the white majority, even in the North, finally said, yes, this is an evil. This is why we had problems with Reconstruction. This is why there's been problems with Jim Crow and other things that have lasted for well over centuries, really. If you think about all the centuries of slavery. So where did Adventists fit? 1831, again, go back to that year. In August of 1831, there was a black man living in Virginia named Nat Turner. Have you ever heard of Nat Turner? Nat Turner is famous in the history books because he leads the bloodiest slave revolt in America's history. He led a revolt where something like 50-ish whites are killed and slaughtered in their beds at night. And in a backlash, the whites in the South were so furious they killed something like 130 black people just to seek their revenge. That was so pivotal, and it changed the way that it was done. Before this, people, if they were black, they could learn to read. They could study their Bibles. They could be converted to Christianity. Nat Turner was a minister. He knew how to read. He was preaching. And because of this, people in the South said, this cannot happen. Education is dangerous. And so they passed laws throughout the South forbidding blacks to be able to learn. And effectively, that means they can't be converted to Christianity unless they get some minister coming down that's willing to preach from a slave Bible. Have you ever heard of a slave Bible? Slave Bibles are big Bibles that are literally crafted for the slaves. They have all the stories of liberation, like the Exodus, taken out. And they have all the stories that promote slavery as a good left in. And that's it. And they are called Bibles. And this is presented to slaves as the Bible. And so that is how it was going. But
Copies of them?
oh, yes. There are copies of those. I could get one for the Center for Adventist Research. I don't think we have one, but you can go and see them in museums and so forth. And they're horrible. They're horrible because they're twisting scripture in the worst kinds of ways possible. And so this is the way that it's going. And so there are other laws that will be passed later. For example, whenever the abolitionists are sending a wave of print, anti-slavery prints of the South, they're going to pass laws at the federal level where it becomes illegal for the post office to send anti-slavery literature to the South, and that they have the right to take your mail, federal property, and they can destroy it before anyone can open it. And then there are some states in the South that say, if you come to our state and you open your mouth against slavery, we have the right to kill you.
Wow.
And they would hang you publicly because it was a capital offense. So this is what's happening in the 1830s, and it really all comes back down to Nat Turner's Rebellion. Well, Nat Turner's Rebellion is happening while William Miller is probably driving home in his carriage from preaching his very first sermons on the end of the world, his first series of lectures in August 1831 in Dresden, New York. Of course, William Miller and Nat Turner don't know each other, but William Miller certainly heard about Nat Turner because of the newspapers. Nat Turner, of course, would have never had the opportunity to hear William Miller. Well, William Miller is not an abolitionist at the time, and he's starting to preach, but he comes into the movement very quickly because the first minister of a non-Baptist congregation to join this movement was Henry Jones. Henry Jones becomes a Millerite in December of 1832. He starts to correspond with William Miller. Because of his interest in Adventism, the Millerite varieties, he starts to get interested in anti-slavery because he's reading the book of Revelation. And he sees in the book of Revelation that, oh my word, look at this. Who is engaging in selling slaves in the souls of men? It is Babylon, Revelation 18:13. And so he writes to Miller in 1833 and 1844, and he says to Miller, don't you suppose, we all know that the Catholic Church is part of Babylon, but don't you suppose that because of the Protestant Church supporting slavery, that maybe it is also part of Babylon too, and that we can come out of her? And so Henry Jones from 1834 and 1835, when he's publishing this for the first time, he becomes the first person, the first Millerite Adventist to sound a call to come out of Babylon, and his reason is because of slavery. And Millerites will continue to think about that. And in 1843 and 1844, they will come out of Babylon. And it is not, as you may have been taught, simply because people were rejecting the Advent doctrine. It was first, primarily because of slavery, because all of the churches supported slavery. Go back and read Charles Fitch's famous sermon that he preaches in 1843 during the summer. Out of the gate, he says, we all know the Catholics are Babylon. What about Protestantism? They are Babylon. Leading answer out of the gate, because they support slavery. Boom. And he's also, because of capitalism, he's a little bit against capitalism too, but that's kind of fun. In any case, that is a driving force. And then the second Advent doctrine being rejected is added to that. And that is why Adventists come out of Babylon. And so in that sense, and in many other ways, the Adventist church today literally exists because of anti-slavery. In fact, I don't believe we could have existed without it. There is one amazing abolitionist woman named Lydia Maria Child, famous anti-slavery leader. And she edits a paper and so forth in New York City. And she writes around the Great Reformation, she asks the question, why has Millerism arisen at this time? We can look at history and see many other people who predicted the end of the world. So why now? She asks that question, why now? And said the only answer that she can think of is because of all of the sins in the churches. First and foremost of those was the sin of slavery. I think she was right. There's other people who came to the same realization. So Adventism, Millerism is spreading through anti-slavery networks in many, many ways. And many of the people that become Adventists are anti-slavery activists. And this is important for them. There's no idea of like, oh, Christ is coming, so why should I care about anything on earth? Let's just ignore that, just ignore politics. None of that. They said, no. If you want to be saved, you must be an abolitionist. Joseph Bates says in his autobiography, he would not baptize anyone unless they first said that they were an abolitionist. You had to do this to be saved. Why? Because the Adventists said, we want to show people what they call the genius of the heavenly kingdom. What does that mean? That simply means that they recognize that heaven, contrary to what everyone else is saying, that is a place of racial segregation, if Black people are even allowed to be there at all. They say, no. This is a place where there is no caste, there is no racial barrier. It's a place of equality. And they call it the genius of the heavenly kingdom. And they say, if you want to be prepared for that, if you want to survive judgment without being damned, then you must show your faith by your action now. You must live this now. And so what we see in Millerite camp meetings and Millerite meetings all over is interracial meetings happening at a time where there was Negro pews in the North. If you were Black and you lived in the North, you had to sit in a Negro pew. You lived in the balcony or in the back, sometimes out on the lawn outside of the church, looking in through the windows. If you wanted to be there for communion, you had to wait till all the white people first went through communion, and then you could get the dregs and all the germs, by the way, because they're drinking from one cup. Gross. And Adventists fought against that. As abolitionists and as Adventists, this was part of the faith. If you wanted to be a good Adventist, you had to be an abolitionist. And it gets to the point where Ellen even says, there are a couple of pro-slavery Adventists, and she says they must be disfellowshipped. It was that serious. Ellen was an amazing woman. We talked about the owner of this house, Mrs. Titus, I think it was, and she came here on the Underground Road. But there were other Adventists who participated in that work. We have a couple of them pictured on the wall here. John Byington, the first General Conference president, he operated a stop on the Underground Railroad in Bucksbridge, New York, where he lived near the Canada border. And there are still some buildings that have survived that he built with hiding places for the slaves in those buildings. You can read Brian Strayer's autobiography of John Byington, and there are some pictures in there of that. Also, John Preston Kellogg, who was the father of John Harvey Kellogg. He lived here in Michigan, Tyrone, Michigan, and he operated a stop on the Underground Railroad, and also happens to be closer to Detroit in Canada, and so he was operating a stop there. If you include the Millerites, who I've studied and done a lot of work on for my dissertation, they had, as it turns out, dozens and dozens that I have found, and so much so where I'm not even going to look anymore. I just keep finding them randomly that are working on the Underground Railroad in some capacity. People who are actually Seventh-day Adventists, which is a much smaller group of people. I have at least half a dozen, maybe 7 or 8 that I know by name, in addition to the men you see pictured here. Perhaps the most significant in the Adventist tradition is William Still. You see him there pictured at the bottom. He is known as the father of the Underground Railroad. He lived in Philadelphia. He accepted Miller's message of the end of the world in 1843, and he remains his entire life an Adventist, although he never kept the Seventh-day Sabbath. And he was a huge worker on the Underground Railroad. He is the one involved in helping Harriet Tubman to get her freedom and liberty. She comes through his station there in Philadelphia when she's finally liberated from Maryland. And he assists her on all of her trips back to go get slaves in Maryland and bring them to liberty. This box here is depicting the kind of box that Henry Box Brown used to escape. He was from the Deep South, and he put himself in this box and had himself shipped through the mail to William Still's office in Philadelphia, and he actually survived, even though on his journey, the box with him in it fell and it onto the ground, and they put him back on the cart upside down. When he arrives there, he's unconscious but still breathing, and they revive him. And you can see in the picture there, William Still is standing there holding the lid of the box. So we have a strong history in the Adventist tradition of anti-slavery. What is tragic is that tradition does not last. And so when you get to the 20th century and you get to the civil rights movement, that Black people are seeking civil rights for themselves at that time, you have Adventist leaders, white Adventist leaders who are saying you cannot support the civil rights. You must stay silent.
All right, folks. A little tired, so I'm gonna rest a bit. Maybe pick up later in the rest of the service. Thank you for tuning in. God bless. Bye-bye.